Good afternoon. I'd like to call the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting Wednesday, May 10th to order. Julie, could we have a roll call, please?
Certainly. Chair Edson?
Here.
Vice Chair Shields?
Here.
Councilmember Pryor?
Here.
Councilmember Lovell? Planning Commissioner Arth?
Thank you. Could I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Chair, I move to approve the agenda as presented. Second.
We have a motion to approve by Hillary Shields, a second by Councilmember Pryor. Could I have a roll call, please?
Vice Chair Shields?
Aye.
Councilmember Pryor?
Aye.
Chair Edson?
Aye. Do we have any public comments? Come on up.
Good afternoon. My name is Donna Gordon, and I just wanted to comment on the agenda. Today's meeting seems to dovetail off of the resolution discussion we had yesterday with this discussion or presentation on housing. The strategic plan excerpt talks about reducing the mix of the city's housing from 75% single family down to 65%, but it doesn't really address the why. I don't understand why this would be considered something that would be a positive, a net positive for the city of Lee Summit. Introducing more density into development when there's problems with roads, stormwater, sanitary sewer, and other infrastructure issues is just creating more problems rather than less. So I'm not quite sure where the emphasis on density is so strong. The strategic plan talks about strong neighborhoods, but it doesn't talk about the challenges that come with density. And increasing low-income housing options in a neighborhood often initiates a spiral downward in home values. And so this idea that we've got to, that zoning, the report says that zoning is a problem, that single-family homes is a problem, and I guess I'm not understanding why that's determined to be a problem. The report also talked around stakeholders, there was a lot of discussion around stakeholders in the issue in this report, but I didn't see anywhere where stakeholders such as homeowners, business owners, and property owners in the city of Lee Summit were included in part of this discussion. I feel like that if there is going to be a discussion about changing these kinds of things, that there needs to be a representation from not just the people who are involved in these nonprofit events or behind a particular agenda, but should also include a broader cross-section of the community to include those that could be negatively impacted by these developments. So, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pryor, would you please note that Commissioner Arth is now here? Thank you. Welcome. All right. We're moving on to approval of the April 12th Community and Economic Development Action Letter. Could I have a motion?
Chair.
Councilmember Shields.
I move to approve the April 12th, 2023 CEDC action letter. Second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Shields, a second by Councilmember Pryor to approve the action letter. Could I have a roll call, please, Ms. Pryor?
Councilmember Pryor?
Aye.
Chair Edson?
Aye.
Vice Chair Shields?
Aye.
Thank you. And our first item of business is a presentation housing discussion. I'm not sure who's presenting. Oh, there you are. Let me get this right. Nassif?
Yes, that's correct.
Nassif. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Amy Nassif, I don't know if I need this or not. Amy Nassif, Deputy Director of Development. Happy to be here tonight, just provide you with a housing overview and discussion. And just want to set the table on it a little bit for this evening. Tonight's discussion was for us to present data to you. There's no policy ask of ours at this time, no changes to any long-range plans or recommendations at all. It was just to give you a snapshot of some information, and mostly pertaining just to single-family housing, I believe was the direction. So. So a couple things also in your packet as we go along, just to help with the flow of the information provided. I did reorder some of the slides from what you did receive. I did add page numbers though, if that helps with any questions you might have. And then also there's one slide, and I'll point out, where I just had found some additional information which I thought might be interesting to have for this evening, and I'll point that out as we go along as well. But the reason that we are, speaking here tonight about housing and why we do just keep up to date with the data as much as we can is because our Ignite strategic plan, of course, talks about having strong neighborhoods with housing choices and maintaining quality of neighborhoods and providing diverse housing options. And then also our Ignite comprehensive plan. And the comprehensive plan, as you can see here, does have some goals related to the housing choice and housing options that we have. Right here, if you can see on your screen, like the little mix that we have with 65% residential, low intensity, it's 20% medium residential density, which is like townhomes or duplexes, up to the other category of apartments or the high intensity density type. Excuse me. And so again, our comprehensive plan as it stands today has these housing targets for us that we just monitor and keep an eye on. That's on the left side of your screen for you. With the 65%, 20%, and 15% mix, which was established in that plan. And then today's date, we have the existing inventory right here on the side of your screen here. This is going to be from 2020 numbers. And the reason that we're using 2020 numbers is just that the American Community Surveys with the 2020 census, that was the data that we had. And so to keep consistent, we have some data already on 2021 and 22, but to keep the discussion with the same baseline of where the data source was, tonight was all the 2020. And at the end of the year, and we're also in the midst of it currently, we'll be updating and providing an end of the year full report, which will have more accurate or more recent numbers for you as well. So what does our current housing stock look like today? Again, we're using ACS, so we have the first column here is the 2010 data, and then as it compares to 2020. And so the total single family from 2010, you can see we are at now about 33,491, and then with the multifamily mix as well at the bottom. So we have total as of 2020, about a little over 39,000 housing units of choice. And so one of the other questions that we were asked just to answer and provide some clarity on was, what is the difference, or what are we saying when we talk about attainable versus affordable housing? So affordable housing is defined by HUD for us, which is housing, includes utility costs. It's what a household pays. And so a household should not pay more than 30% of their gross income, otherwise they're considered what we call cost burdened. Whereas attainable housing is going to look at the affordability of the households. So with incomes of 80% to 120% of the area median income, meaning what is attainable for those middle income households without becoming that cost burdened. So for Lease Summit where we are, so again, homeowners are considered cost burden if your housing costs exceed that 30%. Lease Summit, where our numbers had us again at that 2020, was about 16% of homeowners would have been classified as that cost burden.
Can I ask
Yes.
you, how did you determine that percentage?
That percentage is done from, again, the American Community Surveys.
Oh.
And they monitor that and keep that data for us. And so that comes again from the 2020 census data information. And they take income surveys that they do based on income levels, and then they qualifiers with cost of utilities, and they also keep track and have surveys on the cost of housing. And so that's how they come up with that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And so just taking a little bit look at it as well. So middle income households, in Lease Summit, what we found from the data information was a range of between 74,000 and 111,000 annually, which makes our area median income in this snapshot of time, we're talking about around $93,000. And at the same time in 2020, median housing values were at $234,000. So 2020, we obtained sale price information there. So the median sales price of a home in 2020 was $304,000 approximately. And again, when we're thinking about and looking at what the price range and affordability is for the attainable housing for middle incomes, it would not exceed that about $280,000 that you see there. And I did, so for this one little slide here, thought it'd be interesting information, was able to obtain a little more recent data for you as well, just for tonight's discussion, homes for sale in April of 2023, so you can see how things have changed so dramatically from 2020. There's about 274 single-family homes for sale just for that month, with a median list price of actually $574,000. So when we're talking about what our AMI would consider attainable for the middle income, not exceeding $280,000, there was only about 5 homes on the market that met that. And so as we're looking at that, so when we had earlier, we saw that 2020, again, just looking at that snapshot in time, that the median home price for sale was about $304,000. This is one of those calculators you can get online, which helps you with your mortgage calculator. So just wanted to share this to give an idea of who would be able to, or how could you afford, who'd be able to afford this $304,000 price, which was that median price. So when we look at the chart on the left here, which also comes from our census research that we did and from the 2020. So if you take the income level of, say, $100,000, that was approximately around 5,600 of our households. And so housing costs being the 30%, and that you don't want to increase over 30% or considered cost burden, it would cost about $2,500, little over $2,500 a month for this $304,000 house, which what was the median price for sale in 2020. So you're really only being able to capture about a little over 50% of the population able to afford that and not be considered cost burdened, if that makes sense. So that was just an example to provide and give. So wanted just to end with what we have currently under construction and what was permitted for build out as of 2022. And this does again exclude multifamily because we were focusing just on the single family questions that we originally had. So we had about 270 single family home permits approved and under construction with that average valuation there. 2 duplex permits, and then we had 3 triplex as well. And again, we're in the midst of updating all these numbers, and we'll have a full report at the end of the year too, but wanted to focus in and hopefully answer the specific questions that you all had, and just to look at data again at this time, no recommendations or anything, but happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Thank you. And just to set the table for the committee or remind them, this is the presentation and the data that Councilmember Lovell had wanted as we get into a discussion about are we really lacking housing stock that is affordable to, say, a firefighter and teacher who are married and looking for a house, or my son and his girlfriend who are looking for a house, or anybody else. So he really wanted to know what is affordable and what are we lacking. So I just wanted to remind everybody of why we're looking at this as we move forward on attainable housing and possibly putting some policy changes in place. So, questions, comments? Councilmember Shields.
No, I really appreciated this presentation. I think it was really good data. And I appreciated that statistic. I think you said that 16% of families in Lee Summit are currently cost-burdened. But when we talk about things like can a teacher, a firefighter, a police officer, someone starting out in their career afford a home here, I think that number sort of hides all the people who are just priced out, that those are people who are able to find something, who are able to stretch their budget and make it work here, and doesn't see all the people that just couldn't find a way. And when you showed those list prices and how many homes were under that 280,000 mark, that definitely sounded about right. I think I've mentioned before about trying to house hunt with my mom here in Lee Summit, and it was really, really hard finding anything under that 300,000 price point. And, you know, you talk about a teacher and a firefighter who are married to each other, but there are also plenty of people who are single who want to be part of this community, and it's a challenge. So I think when we talk about housing options, I think it's, you know, important to think about what will let those people who are doing those really essential jobs be able to be a part of our community. So, and, you know, that it doesn't always have to look like a, you know, 5-bedroom, 3-car garage. That what can we do to find a way to bring in some more duplexes or townhomes or things that maybe have a little bit smaller footprint or just can be that more affordable price point. So I think this is really good data, and I feel like it really fits with a lot of what we've talked about in this committee before. It sort of puts numbers to what we've all been sort of feeling and seeing in our own lives. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Pryor?
Thank you. So I really appreciate this presentation. So I'm thinking back to a couple council meetings ago where they were talking about doing houses on slabs and doing duplexes. And I feel like it's just so hard because it's not necessarily a Lee Summit problem, it's a nationwide problem right now. And it's even the numbers he was giving us on duplexes on a slab were higher, I believe, higher than these numbers. So it's just so hard knowing how to I guess, I don't know, how to provide housing for I don't know, but I think it's just such a nationwide problem that I don't even know how we're even going to address something like this, even in Lee Summit in the current environment. But, and then I also, I noticed that the numbers were from, like you said, 2020, but especially for the multifamily. I know we've approved, I know those numbers aren't accurate now for the multifamily anyway, just because we've approved like Discovery Park, and I know it's going to be in phases, but that's a significant, how many was that? That was quite a few apartments.
Yeah, so we did not, so interestingly, so in 2022 and 2023, we approved a total of about 695 apartment units that have not been constructed yet, and they haven't been permitted yet. And then we have several also going through the process at this time too. And we did not have any building permits approved at all in 2023 for multifamily units. So for a while, they were trending. Most of the time, in the last 10-year span, the majority of the residential was 2-family and single-family. Around 2018, 19, it started to shift a little bit, and we actually had more approvals on the multifamily side. But now this year, we have many that have been plan approved, but not advanced yet too. And the also just to clarify, the cost burden 16%, what is single family homes only. It of course is much larger when you add in renters who are cost burdened, because typically renters who are cost burdened make up the majority of households that are cost burdened.
Thank you. And then also, I actually just don't remember what my question was. But what does, I don't know. I'm going to have to think about it, and then I'll let you know as soon as I remember it.
You're not the only one on here who has that problem. It's fine.
We're not going anywhere.
We'll come back. Mr. Elam, were you wanting to jump in? Oh, no.
She covered it.
Oh, okay, okay. Commissioner Arth, do you have any comments? From a planning commission
I guess I agreed with what you said, Commissioner Pryor, about just the fact that this may be such a big, widespread problem. And so I think it's good to see the study and see what's going on, but I think a lot of it has to do with just the price, inflation, just the way things are priced right now. But I think it's good for us to be aware of it, because it does allow us the opportunity to look at maybe alternative materials or the slabs or things like that. But it's really hard with the way the prices have changed so quickly. They get outdated really quick on that information. So yes, I appreciated the presentation.
Thank you. Councilmember Pryor remembered her comment.
I remember, yes. So this information, does this look at, and this might be a silly question, but does this look at like what's needed like for here and now, or does it take into account like what's going to be needed 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Are we going to be able to, just for instance, like with multifamily or with the duplexes, with it shifting from 75% to the goal being 65%, does it take into account like what housing will look like or the needs? I know generational, a lot of the baby boomer generation, they're getting older, they're looking at different housing options other than single family they're looking at. But does it take in account the?
Yeah, so this one did not do a projection. We did not project out or do a horizon with tonight's presentation at all. What we will be working on at the end of the year is what is 2021 data, 2022 data, and 23 data look like. And when we start looking at some of our implementation or some of those strategies, a couple ways to address those things is we look at our population trends, and our population right now, over, I think it's around 104,000, and we are projected to keep growing pretty steadily, I think over 10% over, the next 10, 20 years, like every year. And I believe our household size is still steady at around 3.1, average people per household size, which is always funny when you have a point then there. And then also your vacancy rate is what we will be looking at. And the vacancy rate is usually a really big indicator. A healthy market has a vacancy rate of around 5 to 7%. When your vacancy rate is way too low, you don't have enough to offer. And that also is one of the ways, besides building material costs and other things, that prices rise. And also prevents people from reinvesting in their existing homes and, for the quality of life issues that you have. So long story short, yes, we will be looking and doing some of those projections, as we continue to study, and some of those other reports we had did that, for us, but the vacancy monitoring and population projection and what those trends are nationally, which usually always end up coming our way too, we're keeping an eye on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and a couple of things. Looking at future projections, I know we can look at trends, right? But some projections are hard, because I remember when Cerner moved in out by Bannister, and everybody started going, and started thinking about apartments out on the west side of town because that's going to feed Cerner. Well, a couple of years later, here we are. I don't know how many employees Cerner or Oracle or whoever has out there, but those things tend to happen. But I'm also wondering too, as we talk more about economic development and bringing large employers to town, whether or not we can work with those large employers on workforce housing. If you look at historically, employers would build workforce housing for their workforce if it didn't exist, especially after the wars. I think my in-laws actually work in housing that was built by Armco up in Independence. So, those are conversations I think that may be worth having with future employers. I don't know, maybe. Mr. Elam, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points on that. I think the conversation about workforce housing and employment, that goes hand in hand. Nationally, Amazon's got a really large housing fund that they're working in, and they're doing housing not just for their workforce. That's a big benefit for them, but they're doing it for communities as well. They've kind of got a mission-driven approach that they've taken to that as one example. But again, that's a really, really large employer that has a scale to be able to do some of that stuff. But definitely something that we need to look at, because the workforce housing and the workforce are two key drivers of economic development overall right now. And then the second one was the comment on projections. And I'll just say, I think all projections are hard. If we had the ability to tell the future, that'd be fantastic. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try on there. And for example, the Cerner things are, whether or not Cerner's the driving factor or not, our vacancy rates in our apartments would say that there's still a clear demand apartment product, as well as the housing market in general. As Ms. Nassif was saying, if you have limited supply, the prices go up because the demand is still there overall.
So now that we have this information, which we know, and we're going to make Lovell watch the meeting and read it, how to move forward and get back to our, how do we encourage affordable housing? Or maybe we need to get through the incentive presentation first. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So tonight, we didn't have any further discussions about affordable or attainable housing on the agenda. Felt that this would be good information to provide, seek feedback on other information to look into or other directions to go down to prior to having that further conversation. We do have all the information from the Ignite Comprehensive Plan up on the website, and we will be updating that as was mentioned, and updating that continuing forward. So through that process and through these conversations is really where we're trying to get our direction from on changes to look into.
And I'm a little disappointed. Didn't you tell me you all had data on like where our workforce is coming from and in and out of Lee Summit? And,
We
no?
we do.
Don't have it with me.
You don't have it with you? Okay. All right. No, I didn't know if that was going to be part of the presentation, and we can discuss that later. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we definitely can provide that. This was focused just on housing and wasn't necessarily focused on just on workforce. So we'll definitely write that down and work towards having a presentation on that.
Yeah. Don't get too excited about it, Josh. You got excited about that.
Speaking of workload or whatever, I was looking at future agendas and how to program them, knowing we have a big incentive presentation tonight and probably another one. We could easily get booked through August right now, like without blinking an eye, so just something to keep in mind.
That's why I did what I did last night. So, all right. So any other comments, questions before we move on to the next presentation? No? Good? Okay. So we're going to talk about economic development incentive policy, and as you just heard from staff, we will talk about this more than once. There are a lot of different reasons we're talking about this. One, and Mr. Elam, please jump in at any time. One, due to discussions on the dais, every time we have projects that want incentives, comment or discussions that appear on the dais during council meetings, during those presentations, it was clear that we need to take another look at our incentive policy. And we look at this every year. Does this come to CEDC every year?
Correct.
Yeah.
Every year, every 2 years, we want to make sure that the incentive policy is following the practice and following the guidance that council is given as we go through a number of different projects and presentations. I'm sure Mr. Bushek will talk a little bit. Hopefully I'm not gonna steal his thunder, but he always, what do you always say, that projects create
Problems?
Projects create history, history creates policy, and policy guides our projects.
There we go.
Okay, you should needlepoint that on a pillow.
I was thinking about it.
Okay, and also, because one of the, having this on tonight regarding housing, you know, do we want to be able to use any of these tools to get the type of housing we need and want? Is that a possibility? Is there a desire by council? Is there not a desire by council to do that? So, Mr. Bouchard.
Good evening, David Bushek, Chief Counsel of Economic Development and Planning. I've been nominated to lead the discussion, but this will be a group effort depending on how the discussions and the questions go. The purpose of this discussion is to review the incentive policy, determine with your input what changes we should make to the policy, and then bring that back at a future meeting. And thinking of the schedule, we're starting tonight with just a discussion of some of the major issues. And then if we're ready, based on your feedback tonight, we can bring back some proposed changes to the policy at the next meeting, or we can continue the discussions and come back in July, depending on how things go. So we'll see how it goes with this discussion tonight. And To begin then, my discussion really has three parts. First will be, it's labeled here an historic overview, review the history of our incentives, but it's also some background information that the council has sort of requested from time to time based on discussions we've had on various projects, which hopefully will be useful for you. And then second, we will look at some specific issues. Our city team has conducted what we've all come to know as a Ryan Elam whiteboard session, preparing for this meeting, where we get together and list all sorts of issues on a board, and Ryan writes it all up there. And there were far too many issues that we came up with to discuss that we could fit in any one presentation. So we've narrowed it down to just a handful of issues here, the next 4 bullet points, and that's what we'll be focusing on. The last bullet point there, you can ignore that. That was the previous presentation you just had. I wasn't sure what sequence we'd be presenting these in. And then also, as part of this discussion, in the context of these 4 points, or however you see fit, we'd like to get your input too on what other issues and questions we can answer for you and how that might shape the policy going forward. And there's a lot of examples to draw from. We've had a lot of conceptual presentations, a lot of incentives that have been approved over the last 12 to 18 months. And so there's a lot of information to draw from as we talk about the policy. So with that, I will get into the discussion. So the first point, a little background, sometimes it's good to just think in terms of some of the simple concepts of economic development, because as we see in almost every council meeting now, we get into a lot of deep discussions and a lot of numbers about specific projects. But a few of the basic tenets. When we're talking about incentives, it's really adjustment of taxes, adjustment of real property taxes, sales and use taxes, or enacting new taxes. So it's really discussion of taxes that we're talking about in each case. The second bullet point, this is a very important point that I'll come back to later. The city has the ability to legally adjust the taxes of other taxing districts. That's a very important point for the city council to keep in mind when you're considering an incentive request, and I'll emphasize that a little bit later. Whenever we're talking about incentives, from a decision maker standpoint, there's really 2 purposes for the incentives, ultimately. Does it induce a project that would otherwise not occur, which we talk about as the but-for test from time to time. But for providing this incentive, this project would not happen. And if we think the project would happen, but not to the extent that we would like, does it enhance the project? Ultimately, those are the 2 main purposes for providing incentives whenever you're considering an incentive request. All incentives involve a public purpose, and I was thinking about what those are. It can be a long list, but I would say the big 4 are essentially building public improvements and public infrastructure, economic development, just basic economic development, meaning enhancing our tax base, enhancing the tax revenues for the city and the other taxing jurisdictions, which can spin off into related issues like job creation, serving the increased population in the city. The third is blight clearance. One of the purposes of many of the tools we use is to clear blighted areas, and the city council makes a blight finding when you're approving certain incentives. And then a fourth one, and this is actually significant, but we don't really discuss it that much, is implementing the comprehensive plan. That's a factor in a lot of the incentives as they appear in the state law, because some of our incentive tools are designed to be city-driven, meaning the city designates an area as a blighted area that it would like to encourage redevelopment. And so one of the functions associated with that declaration is we want to encourage redevelopment that's consistent with the comprehensive plan, which we've already thought about and approved before we get to that redevelopment stage. Most of the incentive requests that the city receives are developer-driven, meaning the developer makes the request and we respond. And in that situation, it's incumbent upon the developer to achieve zoning approval, and hand in hand with zoning approval is consistency with the comprehensive plan. So even though consistency with the comprehensive plan is a significant factor when we're analyzing incentives, usually that box is checked through the zoning process, so it's not a significant point of discussion. And then the last point that I would mention is, I sort of just alluded to it, one of the main purposes of our incentive policy is to make it fair and available for everyone, but we're not in a situation where the city staff is asking each applicant, hey, would you like to request incentives? That's not how it works. We rely on the developers to make a request to the city, and then we process it, and our policy is our guide for how we process those incentive requests. This slide shows the basic types of incentives, and this is mainly as a reference, and we might come back to this later. I've talked about this with the council at various times. There's three main types of incentives. There's tax redirection, which is typically tax increment financing, could also be sales tax reimbursement agreements, which are not that common, but we have a few examples. Second, tax abatement. There's the various forms of tax abatement that we've considered for numerous projects. And then there's enacting new revenues, which is essentially enacting a new sales tax or a new type of assessment. And those are through community improvement districts, transportation development districts, and neighborhood improvement districts. When we're analyzing the impact of incentives to the city and the taxing districts, it's the first two categories that really create an impact to the city. An argument could be made that that third category doesn't really impact the city because it's creating a new revenue source, so it's not pulling from what would otherwise be an existing revenue stream for the city. This slide then analyzes the question which I've heard from some council members and I've heard from some staff, and I hear when I'm talking with the development community, the question would be, why has Lee Summit historically provided incentives? And sometimes the question is phrased, why has the city provided so many incentives for so many projects? This is my evaluation of what I think the answer is based on my work with the city over 2 decades in the field of economic development and planning and zoning. There's some exceptions to these rules, but I think this is the basic answer to that question, why has the city provided incentives? And it breaks down by primary land use category. For commercial, I think the primary reason historically is to generate revenues, to fund public improvements, and also induce a project. So we have numerous examples throughout the city, but we could look back to the city's first major tax increment financing district, which was the Summit Wood Shopping Center. I think it's fair to say that in that case, that shopping center, as it was built and as it sits today, probably would not have occurred without the use of that TIF plan. That's not to say that the property would not have been developed, but I think it's a fair statement, having worked extensively on that project 2 decades ago, that it would not be the shopping center that we know what it is without the use of tax increment financing to cause that project. I think that's a true statement. So then you get into the sort of analysis of, well, does that mean the property wouldn't have developed at all? Probably not, but I don't think it would be the shopping center we know today. And that shopping center paid for a substantial amount of public improvements surrounding that area. It paid for Chipman Road improvements, Pryor Road realignment and Pryor Road improvements, the off-ramps from Highway 50, and then the flyovers that lead to Blue Parkway. So that's just one example of substantial public improvements that were funded through that commercial project. Second category, residential. Over the last 6, maybe 7 years, there's been a substantial amount of residential incentives that the council has approved. And if you were to boil it down to the primary reasons, I think it would be to reduce uncertainty associated with the taxation process, which the council's heard many times regarding Jackson County's valuation of property and what that does to the pro forma of developers, and also lowering their cost to induce a better project. I think those are the primary reasons. And then the third category, industrial, very different answer here. It's really regional competition. There's a growing demand for industrial in the region, and I think it's a very true statement that if the city council had not approved the recent incentive packages for those large-scale industrial projects, they simply would have gone to another city and they would not be developed in Lee Summit. And that's mainly because the other cities before Lee Summit did provide those healthy incentive packages to those companies. Whether we like it or not, the companies came to expect that, and I really don't think it would happen in Lee Summit if the city hadn't improved those incentive packages. And then the last category, we have many mixed-use projects, and it's a blend of all these purposes depending on the nature of the project. So this is a chart that the council has asked for on many occasions. This table, it's too big to really process on the page here, so I thought a paper version would be handy. So the one metric that we've used across the board for all incentives is this reimbursement ratio. It's the ratio that we've talked about, which is comparing the amount of the incentives or the value of the incentives to the company that's making the request to their total project cost. It's the one metric that we found we can use regardless of what the incentive is. So it applies to all the different categories of incentives and can apply to all of the incentives. And you hear me talk about this every time conceptual presentation is made. We talk about this reimbursement ratio. I think it was probably Mayor Pro Tem Lopez, maybe last year or longer ago, that requested, could we see this data all laid out? So I finally it took quite a while, but I finally produced this chart. And I'll walk through it, won't go into detail, I'll summarize it for you, but the main point of this chart is on the far right. That's a graph showing the reimbursement ratio, which is the value of the incentive package compared to the total project cost for each project. So that's the piece of information that we talk about with every project. Here it is, all laid out across every incentive project that the city council's ever approved for the last 23 years, where I could calculate this data. So the way this chart works is, if you start on the left, it's organized chronologically. It just starts in the year 2000 and works down. I was thinking there's different ways to organize this, maybe by type of incentive, but there's so many projects that use multiple incentives that would be very hard to do. So chronologically is the best that I could come up with. Then we have some of the basic data, the acres, total project costs, total reimbursement, and then the reimbursement percentage. Then the green columns are the different land uses associated with each project. And then the red columns, the reimbursement type and their percentage, have broken down the type of incentive associated with each project and the specific reimbursement portion associated with that particular incentive for that project. And then on the right, the numbers accumulate again, and it shows you the total reimbursement. So there's a few things that whenever you're presented with a wall of data like this, I know it's overwhelming. When I see something like this, I'm sort of overwhelmed with the data. But here's some things that I think are some takeaways from this. You'll see that the city's earlier use of incentives were more favorable to the developer, whereas some of the percentages are smaller more recently. Why is that? Probably because we weren't focused. One of the reasons is we weren't focused on this sort of metric. If you go back 15, 20 years ago, it's not something that we focused on. And I think it's for the reason that we started at the very beginning, which is we have these projects which creates history. History creates our policy. With our policy, we become more refined in how we implement and improve incentives. And so I think you can kind of see the trend there. And then where the numbers get very low recently, those are the residential projects. And the only real benefit there from the developer's perspective is sales and use tax reimbursement on construction materials. And that's where the numbers get very low. And that's another point, another takeaway. The residential incentives have less impact to the city as compared to some of the other incentives. From my experience, having worked with numerous other cities before I came back in-house here, I can tell you that the numbers roughly match what other cities have seen. I've talked to the city council about how that reimbursement ratio historically in Lee Summit and the other cities I worked with was between 5 and 25%, and these numbers bear that out. There's some exceptions. There's some that are lower. There's some that are higher. But Lee Summit is right in keeping with the incentives that have been provided by other cities that have provided some or substantial incentives. We have a very large data set to look at now, and I would say this is comparable to Independence. I worked with the city of Independence for 15 years. They use TIF much more extensively, but they've also approved a lot of CIDs and TDDs. I don't know if Independence could produce a chart like this if they have enough data, but their chart probably would look something very similar to this. So I would say that Lee Summit is right in line with other cities' use of incentives to the extent other cities have provided extensive incentives. And then I guess the one thing that we can draw from some of the numbers at the bottom, if you look at the numbers in the blue column, based on what's on paper, so I'll say this before I look at these numbers. This is all the projects as approved. Not all of them have been constructed, and some of them, to the extent they are constructed, they're not fully constructed. So we're looking at all of the data as it appears on paper as the incentives were approved. But if you take a look at the numbers at the bottom in the blue column, total project costs, through our incentive program, we have induced $2.78 billion worth of investment in the city. The cost to the taxing districts is the next column. The total reimbursement rounded to $580 million. So if you're analyzing this data, the city has approved $580 million worth of incentives to the development community to induce approaching $2.8 billion in investment. Now, if you think back to that bullet that I mentioned on a previous slide, when you approve incentives, and we're talking tax redirection and tax abatement primarily, not the new taxes, the impact of the city is only a portion of those revenue streams. And generally, when it comes to real property taxes, the city's portion of any tax bill is 17%. When we're talking about sales and use tax abatement, the city's portion is in the ballpark of 24%. So one of the things that I did, and you can't see it on the chart here, I went through this chart and I subtracted from the total reimbursement column all of the new taxes. So I went in and subtracted all of the CID and TDD components, which are new taxes as opposed to loss of taxes, tax redirection or tax abatement. And so if you take out the new tax component, the total reimbursement column goes down to $470 million. And if you apply the percentages that I just described, the city's percentage, and this is in the aggregate across the entire table, the city's portion of that is about 94 million. We could round it to about 100 million because these are very rough numbers. So a significant takeaway from this is that the impact to the city approving all these incentives, the cost to the city is about 100 million, and we've induced about $2.8 billion of investment. That's a significant takeaway from this chart for me.
Chair, if I may, just on the same note of the takeaways on this chart, that's over essentially a 23-year period through there, because this is kind of calculating the whole thing.
Right.
Roughly. And then some of these reimbursements actually will go further out of than that 23-year period. So the roughly $100 million that David just mentioned was over, I'm going to guess, total 40-ish years, considering we've got some TIFs that don't have some areas activated yet on here. So just another way to think about kind of the time value associated with some of these as well. And I will say that now that we've put this together, we've already been talking about ways that we can enhance it and ways that we can keep it up to date and make it more publicly facing on a regular basis. So those are all next steps. So when David and I get together, we tend to just start building on things.
The whiteboard conversation? Is
Yeah,
that what that
the
is?
Ryan Elam whiteboard conversations.
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to save that because in the interest of time.
David, Councilmember Shields.
Sure, and this
has
is a good
question.
pausing point before I get on to the next
Okay.
slides.
Okay. So I just had a kind of I guess, a methodological question is, for example, when we've had some of these discussions, especially with some of the multifamily developments, there's been a lot of, I don't know if I want to say dispute, but a lot of back and forth about what the real value of their incentive is, because it depends on what the county might tax them at later, and it depends on whether they would appeal those taxes and things like that. So when you come up with something like the percentage value on here, how do you do that for a project where it's kind of the total benefit to them is going to depend on what their tax bill would have looked like in 10 years?
So there's just a handful of those examples recently, and those are the residential projects. The issues really cropped up in the last year to 18 months. And the interesting thing is, those issues were present, but they weren't really analyzed with some of the earlier versions of the incentives that were approved by the city council. As we've gotten more sophisticated with our analysis, the issues come up. I would advance the argument that I would win that debate with the developers, and I can tell you why. The county told us at the beginning of last year that they intend to use the 90% of construction costs for the valuation. We have one example of where that's happened, and that's the new apartment project that's open in Streets of West Pryor. The county's valuation of that project matched what they told us. That's the one data point we have so far.
So when you calculated these amounts on this sheet that you gave us, you're basing it on
My
on those
numbers.
kind of estimates or numbers?
Correct.
Okay. I was just curious
Yep.
how you handle something like that. And then would this get updated over time as we see what those actual valuations come in at and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so there's another chart that we have where we have tracked the fixed pilot on those residential projects and then the county's valuation. And it's updated through the one project that I just mentioned, and we continue to update that on a regular basis. So we'll do another snapshot this year, we'll update that table, and I'll probably think of a way to simplify that table and incorporate it into the more recent tables that we have here so we can continue to analyze that data as we go forward.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you.
Question? David, the reimbursement ratio, we always look at that when we're looking at projects and looking at how it matches with what we've done, right? But I don't see that is in the policy. It's not a policy.
No, it's not. It's not something that has made its way into the policy yet. And so I suppose that, I mean, that's a great question. Do we want to incorporate that into the policy somehow? And if so, how? I don't have an answer to that tonight, but I kind of thought that somebody might ask that question, and I've been thinking, should we do that? And we have a good data set to then say for commercial, for industrial, for residential, here's our track record. And going back to the basic philosophy of our projects create history, our history is going to guide our policy. Maybe we should start looking at that as a factor to include in the policy. And the policy then, recently anyway, it's a statement of guidelines. Most favorable consideration will be given to projects that fill in the blank. That's what we've done most recently, and probably what we'll do with the next revisions when we bring those back. So a question for you would be, and we'd like to get feedback, should we use some of this data to include some of those guidelines for the different categories of land uses and the incentives?
Okay, hang on. Mr. Elam?
Chair, just, it is mentioned in one location in the policy, and that's related to TIFs specifically, but it hasn't been applied as a broad metric as we've applied it here.
Is that because it's with TIFs, is that state mandated, or?
I don't believe it's a state mandate, but
No,
David will answer that.
So that's a good point. The policy does say, in effect, most favorable consideration will be given to TIF projects that are less than 25% reimbursement. And that, if I had to think of a reason why that appears in the policy, if you go back to some of our earlier TIF projects, that was kind of the benchmark. Some at Woods and some at Fair, largely. The incentive ratios for those, they're on here. And I think that 25% was based on those two major TIF projects that were approved early on in this history of the city improving incentives.
Okay, so the previous question that you asked, were you trying to get at, do we want to adopt or consider a ratio for the different types of development? Is that what you said?
Correct. That's
Okay.
something we could do.
Okay. Discussion, questions? Yes.
I think it would be a good idea, since it seems to be our practice at the dais to really emphasize that, especially in the conceptual presentations when people are looking for feedback from us. I think it'd be helpful to have that in our official guidelines, with the caveat that I feel like there should be something about the situation on the ground. For example, one project that we looked at had serious literal undermining, that there was real substantial remediation was needed. And I think in a case like that, I want something in the guidelines to say, if there's real substantial roadblock to development,
Extraordinary
something like that, extraordinary
circumstances.
circumstances, that we would consider a larger ratio, because, otherwise that property could never be developed, because it was just, there's nothing that could go on it, that it would just collapse.
Right.
So that's my only caveat, but I think it would be a good idea, since it's what we're already doing. We should be clear about it with the development community, what our expectations are.
Very good.
Councilmember Pryor, you have anything to add?
No, I agree with Councilmember Shields, but,
Yeah. Well, and I wonder too, as far as residential, do we want to just have it one ratio or consider the size of the project? You have any thoughts on that? Because if it's let's say it's a residential, it's a 10-house cul-de-sac. Do we want, is that ratio going to be the same as a, 200-home neighborhood? Or does it matter? Yeah.
I guess it seems to me like the same ratio should apply, especially if what we're trying to do is incentivize types of development that we want. It'll be harder for a small development to do that just because of the economy of scale. Doing all the applications and everything won't necessarily be worth it to them, but I don't think that we also want to somehow perversely incentivize people to break up projects into tiny little pieces rather than thinking of them in terms of a large
Good point.
overarching development where you can plan all the infrastructure at once. And I could just imagine someone breaking up their 200-house subdivision into 10 little subdivisions that each come before
Oh,
us.
I can't believe anybody would do that. No.
Nobody would work the system like that.
All right, Mr. Bishop.
Okay, so with that, I will move on to the next slide, and this is where we get into the specific list of issues that we are bringing to you for your input. The first is conceptual presentations. There may not be too much to talk about here. It may be mostly a check-in. We talked about this with you, I think it was last year. We're doing a fairly detailed conceptual presentation. Process seems to be working. We previously asked this committee whether you'd like to see any changes to the conceptual presentation. But for example, looking at the presentation last night, I think is a great example of how the process works. Even though it was basically negative feedback provided to that applicant, an argument can be made that it provided a substantial benefit to the applicant because they were able to realize what they may need to do to proceed with their project, as opposed to, if we didn't have that, they may have gone through the whole process, spent a lot of money, and then received a no vote. So an argument can be made that it's working fine. So we'd like to get your feedback on that. And then a couple other points I'll mention before I ask for that feedback. Project management and council agenda management. One of the things that we saw happening, and we continue to see happening, is we have a lot of projects coming in. There's a lot of projects in the hopper, and we're trying to keep our council agendas restricted to one conceptual presentation per agenda. We're going to try to not stack things up because we've seen that they get detailed, they get very long, and we don't need 10:30 meetings every week. So that's kind of our new practice right now. Even though last night was 10:30 for other reasons.
You're just taking all the fun out of it.
So I guess I'll pause before I get to the last bullet point. Anything to discuss from your perspective on conceptual presentations?
I have a question. Commissioner Art, you all don't get the conceptuals. You don't get them until the PDP comes, correct?
Generally speaking, I think we've seen a few, have we seen?
No, so the planning commission doesn't see anything like the council sees a conceptual presentation. The first items they see are the actual zoning applications,
Okay.
typically rezoning and PDP or special use permit. There's no check-in before the zoning hearing. And that,
Okay.
and there's a legal reason for that too, that we don't do that.
I'm
Okay.
thinking maybe have we had them here at this meeting before, though? I don't know. I thought I have seen a few of them, but I understand we don't usually get involved at all until
Till the zoning stuff. Right.
Yeah. I personally think you're right. I think the conceptual process is going really well. And I think it helps the developer and saves them on the back end, really. So they don't come with the PDP and we can just tear it apart and go, no, that's not gonna happen.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Anybody have any other thoughts? Councilmember?
I like the conceptual presentations. I think they're valuable.
Okay, good.
If I could
Councilmember
add,
Shields?
No, I agree. I appreciate them. I think they're good for us and the developers. As far as not stacking them, I appreciate that because I just don't think clearly after like
Yeah,
2:30 at
that's-
Well,
night.
well,
us
and
too.
I think we tend to get more angry as the evening goes on, and
Probably true.
yeah.
I guess my only question is, if you were to tell a developer, we have the option for this conceptual presentation, but the next opening on an agenda is 6 months from now, do you want to do that, or do you want to just move forward in the process? Do they have that choice, or do they need to do the conceptual, or how does that work?
We haven't hit that point yet. The farthest out, like right now, I have a list of, for the work that I deal with economic development and then also planning and zoning mixed in, and what does that look like on each council agenda, I'm looking out the next like 6, so into July, basically. So we have some projects where they have said, and we've received their incentive modeling, we'd like to make a conceptual presentation, and we've said, we're kind of booked up through the meeting after July. So we're not 6 months out, but we are, in some cases, 6 weeks out, like that.
So at this point, it's not an issue, but if it were to get to that point, I'm just curious, is it a requirement, or it's really just for their option? They like to do it to get feedback before they go further?
So the policy does specify certain circumstances where a conceptual presentation does need to be made, but I think based on recent practice, recent being the last 2 years, any project requesting incentives has come to you with the conceptual, because when we talk to them, we say, here's how it works, and it's probably to your benefit to get a non-binding soft thumbs up or thumbs down before you undertake the entire process. And nobody has resisted that yet. So that's become our practice.
So if I can jump in on that too, there are guidelines in the incentive policy that have thresholds, that if your incentive request meets the thresholds, and generally it's, say they're seeking a 50% abatement through an LCRA for a certificate of qualification. That is allowed to go straight to the LCRA board and the council. If they're over that, or if they're wanting a longer term, or if they're wanting some things that are not specifically set out in those guidelines, then a conceptual is required. And I think part of the reason why most of every project has come through a conceptual is because they've been outside of those guidelines that are stated in the table that's in the incentive policy.
Okay, that makes sense, and I agree. I think it's working well. I don't
Okay,
think you need to make any major changes.
Good, that's kind of what we thought, not broken, keep doing, it's working well. Okay, the last bullet point, what we call the permit rule, there's a provision in the policy which says the city council will not consider or grant incentives for projects that have received any type of building permit or infrastructure permit. And then there's a list of 4 exceptions in certain circumstances. We've run into, because we've received so many incentive requests and there's so many different situations that have occurred over the last couple of years, we've run into a lot of odd situations where applying that permit rule has become a challenge. And so I think on this point, we would like to propose some changes to this rule to refine it. And I'll give you an example, one that came up recently. Proposed community improvement district for a shopping center rehabilitation project, and they have a whole slate of work that they plan to do, including demolition of certain spaces before they go in and improve those spaces. Applicant made the conceptual presentation to the city council, received positive feedback, I think it was unanimous positive feedback from the city council. They were ready to start pulling demolition permits, and we said, time out. The policy says if you pull any sort of building permit, which includes demolition permits, the city council will not approve your incentives. You've received conceptual positive feedback. You haven't gone through the public hearing process yet. So if you pull a demolition permit now, there's the possibility that the city council might apply the policy and not approve your community improvement district at the official stage. The best we can do is warn them of that. There's nothing that says they can't pull those demolition permits, but it's our job to warn them. If you do, this is the potential consequence. So those are some of the situations where it doesn't really seem to be what the rule's addressing, but we still have to deal with it somehow.
Well, I think you want to, or my perspective is, we don't want to be in a situation where somebody buys a piece of property and goes, I'm going to redo this whole thing. I'm going to start demoing tomorrow. Gets 5 days in and goes, I'm never going to be able to afford this. So he's got the permit and he backs up and goes, I'm going to go see if I can get some incentives on this. I mean, that, to me, that's the situation we want to avoid, encouraging.
Right, it seems like the spirit of the rule is, we're only going to approve incentives if you actually need the incentives, and if you're starting the project without incentives, that's a signal that you don't need the incentives.
Yeah.
That seems to be the spirit of the rule.
Yeah. So can you write that to reflect this, these thoughts?
Right, I think we'll come up with some revisions some refinements to the permit rule to deal with these odd situations we're encountering.
Or maybe just if they've provided something in writing to the city that, yes, I plan on doing this, and I don't know.
Yeah, I think we can work with that.
In a similar discussion, the timing of the conceptual presentation and any sort of rezoning or PDP action, we don't have any statements that specifically state when that timing should occur. Our practice has been that if a project is seeking a rezoning or a PDP, we try to marry those up and not get necessarily, what we really try to avoid is getting the rezoning ahead of the incentive. But if the incentive discussion occurs before the rezoning, that's not necessarily been much of an issue. I'm curious from the committee, your thoughts on that. Should there be a specific statement about that? And it would only apply in situations where they would be seeking a rezoning, which isn't every situation.
Councilmember Shields?
I guess I don't really see the issue of rezoning before you do an incentive request, because the zoning itself doesn't guarantee anything's going to be built. It just changes your ability to, what you can do with the property. But the fact that they went and they rezoned this property to industrial doesn't guarantee that we're going to approve a development plan or an incentive or anything else, and it could always get rezoned to something else later. I guess I just don't, what's the thinking behind why we don't want those to happen in that order?
I think one general confusion on the project as a whole being considered, I think is probably one of the reasons behind that. And the preliminary development plans can expire. The rezoning does not. So when you rezone something, that's a permanent land use decision until another rezoning occurs on there. So I think that's been part of the conversation and just general feedback from the council, and during the conversations of each, they tend to get blended together.
I guess I don't have super strong feelings on it one way or the other. I would sort of think that we do this whole planning process and this whole thought about what do we want certain areas of the city to develop, what direction do we want them to go. So if we're comfortable with a certain area being developed residential or commercial or industrial, that shouldn't really, to me, be dependent on the particular developer. So if we're comfortable with that, I don't see why we don't just zone it that way, and then if it changes later, it changes. But again, if that's the direction of the rest of the council, it's fine with me that if we don't want to approve zoning until after all these other things are in place. But to me, it's kind of an independent land use decision. Is that what we want this area of the city to develop as?
So perhaps I wasn't 100% clear. I'm not talking about having the entire incentive and everything approved before or even tied to it. I'm more discussing the timing of a conceptual incentive request. So there's awareness from the council that incentives may be sought for the project. So I'm not saying that the incentives all need to be approved all the way through prior to a rezoning action occurring.
My thoughts still stand. I feel like for me, what I get frustrated is when someone comes forward with a full application. Here's what I want to do, this amazing thing I'm going to build. Will you approve my development plan? Will you approve my zoning? Blah, blah, blah. We approve it all. It's going to be great. By the way, I'd like an incentive. That's what I don't want to see, is like where and then I feel like I'm over a barrel because I've said, yes, this is great. I want to see it happen. And like, oh, but it will only happen if you approve the incentive. So like the zoning itself, I don't feel gets me to that point, but like when they go through the whole process to approve their plans and then want to come back and say, oh, by the way, that's.
That's exactly what I was just trying
Okay.
to get the feedback on.
Okay.
Yep.
That's where our thinking is, it might be helpful to have a statement in the policy that says, it's not a law, not a rule, but our preference is for you to make your conceptual presentation before the council makes a final zoning decision. That seems to be the preferred sequence, so you have, you don't get surprised the way you just described.
Yeah. You okay?
I guess maybe I'm still not distinction, but it's not a big deal.
Okay, well, hang on, we'll go back to it. Councilmember Pryor, did you have a question?
Thank you. Well, so I like approving the zoning probably after. I understand what Councilmember Shields says, but I feel like if someone buys it, zoned agriculture, and then we approve the zoning change to commercial, they're automatically making, and then if we don't approve the project or incentive request, then they can turn around and sell it, and they're making a huge profit just based on us already changing the zoning. So I would personally, I think, prefer like, I guess, I mean, again, I'm not, I wish Councilmember Lovell was here, because I feel like this is his thing, but I feel like I'd rather probably go with changing the zoning after approval. But you said not approval, what was it that you said exactly again?
Yeah, so I would not want to propose that we would tie the zoning and the preliminary development plan approval to an incentive request. What I'm proposing is that we make a clear statement that's basically if a project is seeking incentives, they need to make that, I guess, incentive request prior to a preliminary development plan coming before the city council.
Yeah, and I think
Another way of saying that a little bit more clear.
I like that, because I think it keeps us at least somewhat from getting in the boat of we approve the zoning change, and then it's locked in to that zone forever. I can think of a project recently that we did approve the zoning change from, I believe it was residential to commercial. And then there were several people that weren't fond of the project. And in that case, then it would have gone from residential, buying it quite a bit less expensive, changing it to commercial, even if it wouldn't have gotten approved. So no, I think through the conceptual, I like that.
I thought, when they submit their application at some point in time, isn't there a question on there about, are you seeking incentives? Oh, there's not?
No, and that's back to one of the points I mentioned earlier. That's not one of the statements that we ask each applicant.
Okay.
It's incumbent upon them to bring their
Okay.
request forward.
Okay, because I remember one project where he had come forward and gotten all these approvals, and then he's like, I'm gonna ask for incentives, and everybody went, there was one line in something, so I didn't know if
Yes,
it was the
I
application.
was just about to mention that one. That's the kind of situation that we would really like to prevent ever happening again.
Okay.
Which is an applicant saying, by the way, in the middle of page 2, I mentioned that I'm going to request incentives, and then they don't remind us that until 8 months after the zoning approval. That was a bad situation.
Okay, so, Mr. Elam, would you, this conversation's kind of gone in circles, so sum up what you think you heard from us, just so we're all on the same page.
So what I think I heard was that if a project is seeking incentives, they need to make that known prior to the council taking any action on a preliminary development plan. I'll say preliminary development plan in this case, because that's really I think the key, and that's what I heard from Councilmember Shields, is don't want to be going through that preliminary development plan process, having a beautiful project presented, having the thought process be that, oh, they're going to do this at market rate, and then be surprised later that comes back. Now, I'm going to caveat a few things just from a process standpoint on there, but I think that is a policy guideline that we can state in the policy to be very clear that is the order that things need to occur. Not every project is going to need a preliminary development plan. So some of our industrial projects, for example, I think it's Zarega Pasta or the PFG Reinhardt that was coming through. Those projects don't require a preliminary development plan. So it can't be a blanket statement that incentives will not be considered if a preliminary development plan is not filed. But those are more of the one-off situations, and places like the Valley Vista, like our blighted CIDs, they don't require a preliminary development plan. And I think we're actually going to talk about those in a minute, a little bit more detail, and I've got some thoughts on those too. But
Okay.
so I took your question, answered it, and then added a bunch of stuff onto
Yeah.
it. So sorry about that.
No, that's okay. So, and I think too that when you say they need to make it known, well, that needs to be more specific, or we just have an internal, at what point does staff go, yes, they are seeking incentives? And I think you all do a great job of letting us know that, or we ask, but we just need to make sure that's all, everybody knows what's going on. Everybody feel like they're on the same page? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Did you say your question? Oh, I'm sorry. Councilmember Pryor.
So, and I know you said you're trying to avoid like what happened it was kind of overlooked because it was in the middle of a page that is there somewhere that they could state that they're in, like, that to look that they are seeking incentive requests, or like that's the same place every?
Yeah, so one of the, I'm going to call it more administrative updates that we're looking at that we don't have fully prepared for tonight, but we'll come back when we're actually pull the policy up on the screen, is our application process overall. We do have an application that needs to be filled out and go through when somebody is seeking incentives, but I'm looking to clean that up a little bit and make it a little bit more formalized, not just that way it's very clear and consistent for everybody that they know, and that's one of the items that will be on that application.
And then when they say that they are seeking incentive requests, this is just me being curious, do they have to tell you at that time do they typically tell you at that time what incentive requests they're going to make, or do they just say yes?
Yeah, so the typical process is our project managers are working with them through a pre-application meeting or the development project. There's a couple of different ways that we're made aware that they may be seeking an incentive. But they tell us, they ask for resources. We meet with them, our economic development team does, we basically have what we call a pre-application meeting. We go over the basics of their project, what they're seeking, identify the gaps kind of at a high level, and then provide direction onto which of the tools may be a possible fit to help fill their gaps and things like that. So.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right. Next topic, industrial development. As you're aware, the council has approved a few industrial projects with incentives. And so the main question here is, do we want to explore including some statements in the policy regarding industrial development, given that we're likely to see more of these going forward, given what the city council's already approved? One option would be the first bullet, job guidelines. This would, in my mind, be expressing that we would like to see a quantification of the jobs, and then the upstream and downstream jobs that we've talked about, jobs that produce the products that come into the facility, whether it's manufacturing or distribution, and then downstream jobs, how many jobs are created downstream in the flow of the goods out the door, whether it's manufacturing or warehouse or whatever the case may be. I think it'd be helpful to have a statement in the policy that we would like to see them quantify that, and that's something that the council has, the mayor has said affirmatively on numerous occasions, we'd like to see that. Please quantify that for us. So we think that would be helpful. The second bullet point, this is more of an issue I think we'd like to get some feedback on. Tenant identification. For the speculative industrial projects where the developer essentially says, when I build this, I promise I will be able to fill this. There's lots of interest, but they never disclose who their tenants are. And often they say that's, we're confidentiality and we don't want to disclose what the lease rates are and then have somebody steal them, et cetera. But the council, I've seen from your discussion with these applicants, you'd like to know who those tenants are. So it's an issue that we may wrestle with a little bit, but I suppose if you have any feedback on that point, we'd like to hear that. And if you don't have any particular feedback, that's okay also.
Thoughts? Councilmember Pryor?
I don't necessarily want to know who the exact tenants are. I just want to know that they are actively seeking a tenant, or that they have had interest from tenants, interest in their development. But I don't necessarily care if we know exactly who they are, because I know it gets tricky once you say who they are and people possibly targeting them. So,
Okay.
but yeah.
Similar to that, I think it's nice to know kind of general type of businesses. I'm looking at small manufacturing, or I'm looking at this kind of distribution, but not necessarily the company name.
Okay.
But even if we put that in there, I don't know how enforceable it would be. I can't imagine that we would ever say, if company X does not actually rent this space, then we will terminate your incentive, like we don't
No,
do
that's
that,
not something we
so-
would typically do, but it's more, like you're getting at, in the vein of providing more information to the extent that you can, as opposed to just saying, you can't say anything right now.
Yeah.
We'd like to hear a little more about it, is what I'm
Yeah,
sensing.
yeah,
Yeah.
but kind of in more broad strokes and requiring them to identify actual tenants.
Okay. The third bullet point, targeted industrial areas. This is really just something for us to think about. I don't know if there's anything, unless you tell us this, there's probably nothing in particular that we'd bring back right now. But one of the concepts that we've talked about, and this may go back a couple years, is taking steps to essentially draw areas on the map where we would like to incentivize industrial development going, and making a declaration ahead of time through maybe a resolution or some other action by the city council. If you bring a project that is at least X amount of investment that produces X jobs at X salary, we will provide abatement at this rate for you. That's an option of something we could do to encourage industrial areas.
Oh, so it's similar to the map we have now of the blighted
Correct.
area where we're going to encourage it here, so.
Right, I just wanted to mention that because that's something that we could explore if we get more feedback from you or the city council on that. And then the last bullet, I think we will bring back some of these policy statements that will follow the same pattern we have in the past, most favorable consideration, so it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's something that you're encouraging.
So
Okay.
on the targeted industrial areas, the targeted industrial areas are a little bit different than the LCRA redevelopment areas. And then we have our targeted areas for development that were from 2017 that are currently in the policy. I think the thought process here by discussing targeted industrial areas is, do we create another subsect on the map that is specific to that specific type of development that has its own guidelines associated with it for those thresholds, if you will, for something coming forward as a conceptual or something just going straight through the process?
Okay, Councilmember Shields, I saw you reach for your mic.
I guess, I was just wondering, would it be that more most favorable consideration language, or would it be if you meet X, Y, and Z benchmark, then we will give an incentive? Like, are we even able to put that kind of language in there? Like,
Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, it
Yeah.
could be either, and we could do the latter that you just described. There are examples in other cities of where they've passed resolutions that essentially tell the development community what I just described. Here, if you bring in a project that meets these parameters in terms of investment and jobs and salaries, we will approve an abatement for you in this amount, and then there can be these graduated benchmarks. If you provide more of what we like to see, we'll provide more abatement, knowing that in the, like I was discussing earlier, in the industrial area, to be competitive with our surrounding cities, that's almost a requirement. Do we want to take affirmative steps, or are we good with the way we're dealing with it now, is really the question.
is that something that you as staff are still kind of considering and looking at the environment of? Do you have a particular recommendation of what? Because I could see
Not-
either way, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is not at this time, and so I put it in this presentation just to let you know that we're thinking about it, to see if you had any strong feelings, which it sounds like the answer is no, not yet, but it's something I think that we'll continue to evaluate, and if we get the sense that that might be really helpful, we'll probably bring it back.
I'm definitely open to the discussion, but I don't have
Okay.
a really hard feeling about it yet. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to get a map and maybe identify some of those areas. I think, there are gonna be some areas that make more sense than others.
Right, and that's
Yeah.
probably how the discussion would start, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
All right, the next, this was just a helper slide in case we got into more detailed discussion. So the next topic is blighted area CIDs, and the question here is, do we want to include some provisions in the policy regarding blighted area CIDs, since we've seen a number of these? And some of the topics that seem to be repeating themselves, improvements versus deferred maintenance, interior improvements versus exterior improvements. Would it be the council's preference to express some preferences through these guideline type statements on these issues? And here's one of the issue that we've seen a couple times, and it certainly could repeat itself. The question, the best way to phrase the question might be, who's bringing the blight to the city? And so one scenario is, you've got an aged shopping center, for example, and it's owned by a property owner that's owned it for 20 years, and it's run down, and now they're seeking an incentive, that developer is bringing the blight to the city, so to speak. Another scenario is a developer that just purchased a new shopping center, it's in a blighted state, they're requesting an incentive. And you could have something in the middle, which is a developer that purchased a shopping center, say, 5 years ago, and it's continued to deteriorate, and they didn't maintain it, and now they're requesting an incentive. Do we want to make some policy statements along the lines of those issues? And then also along the lines of interior versus exterior, and improvements to the exterior and the look versus the deferred maintenance type of improvements. And I'll say this, using a blighted area CID, all of those costs are eligible, regardless of who caused them and how they were caused. When you make a blight finding, it's just a factual finding. You're saying this property is blighted. You don't determine who caused it or who allowed it to happen. It's blighted. We're approving a CID. We're approving a CID to allow the CID to reimburse those costs, however that came to the city. But do we want to make some policy statements along those lines?
I'm waiting. Council members, oh, I'm gonna go with Councilmember
Yeah.
Pryor, okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
I actually just have a quick question. So is blight designate, and I should probably know this, but I don't remember. Is blight designation, is it defined by state statute, or it is?
Yep.
Okay, but so as far as like identifying blight though, is it are the guidelines pretty loose, or is it?
Yes, yeah, so if we were to do a survey of all the blight findings that the city council has made across all the different types of incentives, it's this sort of age-old debate of, I look at this, that's clearly blighted. Nobody would argue that's blighted. And then we do have examples of where there's a lot of debate, and the council made a blight finding, but we had some council members saying, that doesn't look very blighted to me, but it's still a legally valid blight finding. So there is that range.
Okay, yeah, I know in situations that we've seen, it'll be blighted, and then they'll leave out for whatever reason a tiny little parcel. They'll leave out the blight findings, and I guess I don't ever quite understand why they.
That's probably dealing mainly with ownership issues and trying to, they couldn't convince that property owner to participate because it involves imposing a new sales tax on the property to generate the revenues to reimburse the developer for the blight clearance work that they do. And so it usually is probably a function of they can't convince that property owner to participate and agree to the 1 cent sales tax, typically a 1 cent sales tax.
Okay.
Are you talking about that, or when we look at one of those maps of where we designate a whole big area, but there's a little?
Yeah, actually, both, because because that happened recently with that Ellis Glen. It was everywhere but that tiny little spot was blighted. But no, your question too, so both, yeah.
Right, and I think the answer in the case of Ellis Glen was, at the time that map was drawn over the downtown area, they were targeting the people that did the work for the city, and then the city council ultimately making the finding, avoided the residential properties and included just the commercial properties, I think was the answer there.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Shields, sorry, my brain zipped.
Okay, so this is one that I'm really torn on because, you know, I'm with the general thought process that we don't want to let something that's run down just keep spiraling downwards and dragging down values. But at the same time, especially with like these shopping center facelifts, I really worry that we are incentivizing bad behavior. Because if you own one of these shopping centers and you see that even if it's still in kind of reasonably good shape, looks pretty decent, but you know, you just need a new parking lot and whatever, you can just come and ask for a blight finding and get a new CID put on there, and why would you ever do maintenance?
Yeah.
Why would you ever keep up your property if we just keep granting these? And it just seems like we're encouraging people, and then if you're the one that doesn't put one of these CIDs on, how do you compete with the other ones? How do you, yeah.
So this is a really interesting issue, and I've never had the opportunity to discuss this with the city council because that's not really the forum to do it, but here's my thoughts on that issue. Here's how I think these situations typically happen. You've got a shopping center, and the owner of the shopping center is leasing. They sign these long-term leases, and that produces a certain amount of revenue. And so the developer's locked in to be competitive in that leasing environment. they're locked in effectively to that lease income. And however they get to this point, it's not enough to provide the maintenance to upkeep the way that they would like to. And so they're in these situations where the shopping centers get run down because there's not sufficient revenue. And so when they're coming to the city and making the CID request, it's essentially a mechanism to say, we need another source of revenue to do these repairs because I can't go to my tenants and say, I'm going to increase your rent 10%. They're locked into these leases, and they're locked into sometimes long-term leases. So I think what's happening and what we're seeing on a repeated basis is limited revenue coming into that owner, whether it's the long-term owner for the last 20 years or somebody that just bought in. And so when we see those CID incentive requests, and they don't explain it very well this way, they're seeking a new revenue source paid by the shoppers in that case with the CID sales tax to rehab the shopping center in a way that they couldn't otherwise because of these restrictions under their current leases. That's what I think is going on.
When you look at, for example, someone who's just bought a shopping center that's gotten run down, or they've owned it for a couple of years and it's gotten more and more run down, wouldn't it be factored into the purchase price how good a shape it's in? Like, aren't they paying less because it happens to be run down, and does that not give them some more wiggle room to make these improvements? Like, I don't understand. Like, if you look at a house and it's like, well, it needs new paint and new carpets and a new roof and everything else, you don't pay top dollar for it.
Presumably so, but that's something that they don't disclose to us when we see these requests. I mean, we know the purchase price, but we don't know their pro forma behind the purchase price and how much they're able to sink into the type of repairs that they're seeking assistance with. I mean,
Yeah, but like when you asked, if we should make a distinction between someone who's owned it for a long time and let it get run down and someone who just bought it, I guess I don't really see the distinction, because if you just bought it and you paid top dollar for something that's in bad shape, like that was a bad business decision by you, and I don't think that we should be putting a new tax on people to pay for that.
So I think just to add to that kind of discussion here, when somebody buys a shopping center like that, they could be purchasing the same revenue stream associated with that. So those long-term leases and things like that could be in there. And so depending upon the investor or who they're in there, they're going to have different investment thresholds. They're going to have different things that they're willing to do. And I think part of the question would become in that situation is, what is the public benefit of that? And that is, do we want the center to be maintained to a certain level, or do we want more on that? And that's going to be very highly dependent on the situation through there. But what Mr. Bushek was saying about revenue streams, I think holds true no matter at what point in time that center trades, if you will.
I guess, how do you think about it? How do you respond to the idea of the example that we're setting for every other owner in the city in terms of whether they should bother investing in maintenance or just wait until it's run down enough to qualify for an incentive?
I think it's probably the case that they're constrained by the economics of their situation. And so I'm guessing that in most cases, a developer or an owner of a shopping center is not going to intentionally let their shopping center get more run down in the hopes that they may receive a similar CID incentive like the other situations in the city. I would guess that that's probably not the case in any situation, that it's the particular economics of each shopping center and each owner and their leasing and their income stream and so forth that brings them to make the request to the city. I don't think there's a negative precedential value either way, maybe is the best answer.
Mr. Elam?
I'll chime in a little bit, and I think that that's one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about this in particular. And I think that if we are going to be entering into these blighted CIDs, we need to set the bar high enough to have it be truly that enhancement for the community overall, if that's the goal associated with that. I think of like the Pine Tree Plaza project when that came in. I look at that. That's fully tenanted space now. It's been redone. I think that was a pretty successful use of that tool so far. And so with that one, they had a new PDP. We had an overlay in the area, so they had additional standards that they had to meet associated with it. I think there's a way that we could potentially discuss, if a blighted CID is being considered, what is the must-haves? What are the additionals? What can you do without it? Where's that kind of balance fit? So setting the bar high enough that that it's above and beyond regular maintenance, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to see some of those standards maybe tightened up or made more clear or something. 'Cause I just know there've been a couple of them that have come up where I look at it and I just didn't feel good about what was being asked for, and trying to figure out where do we draw the line between you made a bad business decision and we're not going to fix that for you versus how do we keep our community looking good, and again, like, keep our tax base up, that if no one's renting it and the value goes down, our property taxes go down. It's
Right.
complicated.
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna shut the door on it, but I know that I haven't felt great about what I've seen come before us sometimes.
Councilmember Pryor?
So again, it's tough, but I also think that, I remember Councilmember Edson actually mentioning, it was in your district where Price Chopper is, the Cosentino's Price Chopper. And it was just old enough to where it didn't look terrible, but it was just old enough to where it was starting to kind of be bad. And in that case, it's hard to look at it and see, say, oh yeah, they need a CID, although we'd hate to lose Price Chopper out of there because that's the anchor store, and then all the other stores start moving. And then I feel like the reason that's such a tough thing to navigate, because then if you lose the anchor store, then other stores that we don't love, like the vape shops and stuff, start moving in because it's not maintained and it's not nice. And so they're looking for the tenants that are willing to pay for cheaper rent, that really don't care if it's so I think it directly is related to what kind of stores we want to see. I don't know, it's tough.
I think the grocery store situation is a little different, and that's kind of interesting because if you're the grocery store company and you're saying, we need to do some rehab here, we have to pay for it somehow, we have two choices. We can raise our prices, that brings in more revenue to rehab the store. Now we're not as competitive with the other grocery stores and we're gonna sell less, maybe we have to move somewhere. Or we could use the CID, tax on a 1 cent sales tax, we're not raising our prices, people still shop here, they're paying the 1 cent sales tax, we're still receiving that revenue, but they stay competitive in the grocery store environment. I think grocery stores are a little bit different than those other tenant sort of spaces that we've seen.
Well, I know if a grocery store leaves a strip mall, you're out. I mean,
Right.
because that's such a big space to fill. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I'd like to see maybe raise the bar on some of that, and because you see other developments where they're taking care of it or redoing it, and I can think of a couple, and I was like, wow, those never came before us, so it's the owner doing it. How is the one across the street not able to do that, So, yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Let's see if we can tighten those up and raise the bar a little bit.
Okay, I think that's probably enough direction for us to bring something back to you, and then we'll talk some more about that. Okay, the last issue, issuance fees. We do charge an issuance fee for the projects that result in tax abatement, and our fees are relatively low right now. I've reported to the city council that we have 2 projects recently that decided to make voluntary payments to the city after they learned about the impact to the city's use tax. We started investigating what other jurisdictions charge as issuance fees at the closing. So this applies to like our Chapter 100 and our LCRA incentives specifically. So the question is, should we investigate charging higher fees that are commensurate with some of the other jurisdictions, which could provide a source of revenue to do other economic development endeavors for the city? That's really the question.
Yes.
Okay?
You have one yes? Are you a yes?
Okay, so one of the things that I can do, I have some data from the other jurisdictions of what those issuance fees are. I can bring back some numbers to compare where we're at now versus where they're at, and we'll have some good examples for you to talk about.
If you'd asked us this earlier in the evening, it may have been a no, so I don't know. Yeah,
No,
Councilmember
actually,
Shields.
I really like this because I've been, mentioning every time we have one that's come before us that with the use tax, we are losing out when we give these sales tax exemptions. So it seems like a way to kind of make up for that. And if it's what the surrounding jurisdictions are doing, I don't see why we shouldn't do the same
Okay,
thing.
very good. I mean, that's kind of our thinking too. And my thinking is that the two companies that agreed to make the voluntary payments may have agreed to do that because they're used to the higher fees in the neighboring jurisdictions, and it's really not a significant impact to them when they receive these incentives.
Oh, yeah, Councilmember Pryor.
This is kind of unrelated to this issue, but just in general. So I think I've heard you mention that it's really hard to compare our incentive policy and what we do to like Overland Park and stuff because it's in a different state. But as far as like the similar cities outside of St. Louis, where are we in comparison with their incentive policies? Are we?
I would say that our policy is probably one of the most advanced policies in Missouri. I've worked with a number of other cities doing their economic development work in the Kansas City area and central and south central Missouri, Springfield, cities in between here in Springfield, Branson, basically all the cities in the Missouri side of the Kansas City area besides Kansas City itself. So that's my point of comparison. And I would say our incentive policy